Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's a critical one. We need to take this fire hose of analysis around the massive shift in U.S. trade
A
policy.
huge shift.
Huge, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs. And we're going to distill the true scoreboard for you now that we're 8 months into this really bold experiment.
It was, by any measure, a monumental change, and a sudden one enacted back on April 2nd, 2025. The administration used national emergency powers to raise the effective U.S. tariff rate from, a pretty modest 2.4%,
Right?
all the way up to an average of 17.4%. And just to put that in perspective for you, that is the highest tariff rate the U.S. has imposed since the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930. We haven't seen numbers like that since 1936.
Absolutely. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. This policy wasn't meant to be subtle at all. It had these three huge, ambitious goals. First, to create just a massive number of American manufacturing jobs.
Right, the jobs promise.
Second, to crush the long-standing U.S. trade deficit, especially with China. And third, to generate, and this is the quote, trillions and trillions in revenue to cut taxes and pay down the national debt.
That was the rhetoric in April. Now, here we are in November 2025. So we're going to use the source material to look at the actual data. It's time to see where reality has landed against those three big promises.
Okay, let's unpack this, and let's start with the big one, the core promise that really dominated the headlines.
Yeah.
Jobs. This whole thing was framed around bringing manufacturing back home, have the tariffs delivered.
Well, what's fascinating here is how directly the sources contradict that primary promise. Since Liberation Day through the end of September, the data shows that U.S. manufacturing jobs have actually declined by 0.45%.
Wait, declined. A policy specifically designed to force reshoring resulted in a loss of jobs.
Exactly. And while, wider U.S. non-farm payrolls, they did see a little bit of growth, about 0.22% in that time.
Yeah.
Manufacturing itself shed roughly 60,000 positions. So we are just not seeing the boom the administration envisioned. It seems like instead of a battle of U.S. versus foreign competition, what we're really seeing is an acceleration of the battle of man versus machine.
That structural insight is so key because we have seen those splashy headlines, right? The ones that suggest the policy is working on some level. You see Apple committing $500 billion over 4 years, IBM $150 billion, Eli Lilly announcing a $5 billion plant.
Right.
Isn't that the definition of a manufacturing boom?
It's a boom in capital investment dollars, yes. But that is the crucial distinction the sources are highlighting. Companies are announcing the investment, but that doesn't guarantee an increase in headcount. And if you look closely at the constraints, it's pretty clear why.
So if they're spending billions, what's stopping them from hiring people to fill all this new capacity?
It really boils down to two things. The high cost of labor in the U.S. compared to, global peers, and critically, a widespread skills shortage.
Yeah.
The sources give a perfect anecdote for this.
Which is?
Ford's CEO, Jim Farley, is basically sounding the alarm. He's talking about a very serious nationwide shortage of skilled trades workers.
And we're not talking about low-wage jobs here, are we?
Absolutely not. Get this. Ford is struggling to fill 5,000 highly skilled mechanic positions that pay $120,000 a year.
$120,000.
They just can't find people with the necessary specialized skills. And that speaks to a really long-term structural failure in our, education and training pipeline.
That one data point, $120,000 jobs just going unfilled, that says it all, doesn't it? It suggests that tariffs alone can't solve a deep skills gap. But let me just challenge this a bit. If the policy is working to reshape trade routes, isn't a methy short-term job decline sort of expected, as the old manufacturing gets replaced by this new, high-skilled production?
That's a fair question. The sources would argue that, yes, replacement jobs will arrive, but in much, much smaller numbers than historical manufacturing booms would suggest. Well, think about it. If you're a CEO and you're suddenly facing this massive cost increase on imported parts, you have to find a way to cut costs somewhere else to protect your margins. So what's the better ROI? Investing millions in a multi-year training program for labor that's scarce and expensive, or just investing in automation and robotics?
The robot doesn't demand $120,000 a year, and it doesn't call in sick.
Precisely. The tariffs may just be acting as a powerful catalyst for companies to accelerate automation timelines they already had. So they're using robots instead of creating those traditional assembly line jobs. They're only hiring a fraction of the highly skilled technicians they need to maintain the machines. So goal number one, a manufacturing jobs boom, is, for now, a clear miss.
That is the core tension, isn't it? A long-term structural failure meeting a sudden, really aggressive policy. Okay, let's see how that tension plays out on the fiscal side.
Yeah.
Goal number 2 was generating this huge revenue stream to cut taxes and, make a real dent in the debt. Has the policy delivered the cash?
Yeah.
On the revenue front, the administration can claim a definite, well, a partial victory. The tariffs are projected to generate around $240 billion in additional annual revenue.
Okay, that's not nothing.
No, that money is real, and it has provided significant political cover. It's allowed the administration to avoid officially raising taxes, while at the same time helping to reduce the stated U.S. deficit from roughly 7% of GDP down to 5%.
So $240 billion is a substantial number. It's something politicians can definitely point to. But does that revenue actually make a structural dent in the national debt?
Not structurally, no. And this is where we have to put that $240 billion into the brutal context of the bigger fiscal picture. The U.S. national debt right now is sitting at approximately $38 trillion.
Wow.
Which is 119% of GDP. And maybe more critically, our annual interest payments alone on that debt are now nearly $1 trillion a year.
$1 trillion. That is a staggering number to even try and contextualize.
If you break it down, the U.S. is still running this massive daily deficit. We're growing the debt pile every single hour. So while $240 billion is impressive, it only covers about 87 days of our current deficit spending. It provides relief, sure, but it doesn't change the fundamental trajectory. It is, as you said earlier, kind of a Band-Aid on a major wound.
And beyond just the sheer numbers, what about the immediate costs and the risks associated with this revenue stream? Because it feels like it's built on some pretty shaky legal ground.
That's exactly where the investor uncertainty comes in. The legality of using these national emergency powers to enact the tariffs in the first place. And therefore, the legality of this whole $240 billion revenue stream that's currently under review by the U.S. Supreme Court. This legal limbo alone carries a huge cost.
And we saw how investors reacted to this back in the spring, right?
And absolutely. Fund flows into the U.S. just reversed sharply right after the tariffs hit. After taking in a healthy $20 billion in March, April saw this massive reversal with about $40 billion in outflows. The tariffs were a key driver, raising serious questions for global investors about the rule of law, stability, and this whole concept of American exceptionalism.
And that uncertainty is only compounded by the fact that the administration has basically said they'll continue the tariffs even if the Supreme Court rules against them.
Correct. Which signals a pretty fundamental disregard for the established legal structure. It transforms a trade policy into a regulatory risk, where the rule of law itself is in question. And that just multiplies the uncertainty for any long-term investor.
That transition from domestic fiscal policy to global instability leads us perfectly into goal number 3, crushing the trade deficit, especially with China.
Before we even dive into the data on the deficit, it's worth just pausing on what the source material says about the goal itself. We have to remember that viewing a trade deficit as inherently a bad thing can be a flawed premise to begin with.
This is the cinema analogy, right?
It is. I run a consistent trade deficit with my local cinema. I buy tickets, popcorn, they provide me entertainment. I'm happy to run that deficit because I get something valuable in return. The goal shouldn't be zero deficit. It should be a healthy, two-way relationship.
That's a fair point. But, okay, philosophy aside, did the policy actually achieve its stated goal of reducing that imbalance?
Initially, yes, there was a dip. But the U.S.-China trade balance normalized really quickly. By August and September of 2025, it was essentially back to its historical norms. And remember, the goal wasn't just to reduce the deficit, it was to inflict some economic pain on China. The real question is, did that pain even materialize?
Well, we know Chinese exports to the U.S. fell, about 27% in the third quarter? That has to hurt.
It would have, yeah. Had China not pivoted with what you can only call astonishing speed? While their exports to the U.S. plummeted, China's total exports globally actually grew by 6% year over year in that same period.
6%. So they just found new markets.
They found new markets, and fast. That's the classic global adaptation maneuver. They deepened partnerships everywhere else. Exports rose 14.2% to Europe, 15.6% to ASEAN nations, and get this, a massive 27% increase in exports to Africa. The pain that was intended for China was just exported.
And they're not just exporting goods, are they? They have all this excess capacity that the U.S. is no longer buying, and they're dumping it on the global market. They're basically exporting deflation.
That's the critical connection.
Yeah.
By diverting these massive volumes of goods into new markets, China is helping contain or even suppress inflation for its new partners. So you see Europe with inflation around 2.1%, India at 0.25%, China itself is at 0.2%.
Wow.
It even went negative in September, negatively 0.3%.
Meanwhile, the U.S., the country that enacted the tariff, is seeing higher inflation. It's up to 3% from 2.3% back in April, and it seems to be creeping up because of this protectionist policy.
It is the ultimate unintended consequence. The U.S. risks diluting its own global importance. If China and its new partners, like the EU, which is finalizing trade talks with India, or the ASEAN nations, if they all get comfortable in these new, deeper relationships, the U.S. might just find itself pushed out of the center of the global trade picture.
That dilution risk is profound. Okay, let's shift focus to the listener's immediate experience. The consumer. At the end of the day, who is paying this $240 billion bill for the tariffs?
Initially, U.S. corporations acted as a kind of cushion. They absorbed the shock. They took huge hits on their margins rather than passing the costs on right away. We saw GM, for instance, take a $1.2 billion hit on its Q2 margins alone.
That's a dramatic short-term cost, but you have to assume investors won't tolerate that forever.
Exactly. And recent earnings calls across the industrial and consumer goods sectors have been unambiguous. Companies have signaled they're going to start passing those costs on to consumers starting in the fourth quarter, so we should expect prices on tangible goods to trend up.
But we have to remember the essential structure of the U.S. economy when we think about that impact.
Correct. The U.S. is overwhelmingly a service economy, so this tariff-driven inflation, it's really only impacting a relatively small, slow-growth corner of the economy. Plus, you have the huge tech and communications companies that drive U.S. growth. They make most of their money outside the U.S. anyway, so that provides a kind of structural cushion for the overall economy.
That context brings us neatly to our final segment. What are the strategic implications for you, the investor or business strategist listening to this? If the ground is constantly shifting, where's the opportunity?
The sources are very clear on this. Planning remains tentative. Relying on these tariffs to just settle down would be extremely unwise given the regulatory uncertainty we talked about. Strategically, you have to look at what sectors are being spared.
And those are the big engines of U.S. growth, right? Technology, communication services, financials, healthcare. The tariffs are mostly limited to consumer, industrial, and material sectors.
Precisely. But this leads to a really critical piece of advice from the sources for any investor, which is review your high U.S. equity exposure. The common allocation of around 70% to the U.S. market is probably just too high in this environment.
That high concentration needs to be rebalanced globally. And the justification is that growth is obviously not exclusive to the U.S. anymore.
No. Not at all. We've shown other regions are looking more stable. They have lower, more contained inflation, generally better debt dynamics, and frankly, higher political stability than the U.S. right now. And crucially, they also have very active, very competitive AI sectors. The sources specifically flagged players like DeepSeek in China as a serious competitor. Innovation is thriving beyond Silicon Valley.
What a profound 8 months. So to summarize the scoreboard for you, job creation is down. The deficit is still a huge long-term problem despite the new revenue, and that partial fiscal victory has basically prompted the rest of the world to integrate more deeply without the U.S.
The finding is undeniable. While the U.S. turns inward, trying to reshape the global order on its own, the rest of the world is just adapting. They're building a more integrated global economy without us. And that leads us to the final provocative thought for you to consider.
Lay it on us.
The source material reminds us of a timeless framework, quoting Benjamin Graham. In the short run, the market is a voting machine, but in the long run, it is a weighing machine. So the challenge for you is this. 8 months in, Liberation Day has clearly won a short-term vote by raising revenue and providing political cover. But will it ultimately be weighed as a structural success years from now, measured by genuine stability and dynamism, or just a short-term, incredibly expensive vote?